Thank you very much. My name is Sherry Ann, and I'm an anchor at Bloomberg Television. Our discussion today will be on the prospects for investments, innovation, and inclusive growth in the Americas. I'm very excited to have this conversation, of course. On Bloomberg TV, we've been really talking in recent months about the slowdown that we're seeing globally, and we are now seeing that recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean has started to moderate. The IMF now saying that it has really become uneven, the pace of growth. Of course, we have seen the largest economies in Latin America, like Brazil and Mexico, slow down, and even in places like Argentina, growth completely come to a halt. So it's a really great opportunity to have this conversation, to get a health check of the Latin American and Caribbean economies, and also discuss what we can do in terms of innovation and investments in the region in order to have a more productive and efficient way to move forward. I'm very excited to welcome our panelists today. We have from the World Bank, Axel van Trotsenburg, a Vice President for Latin America at the World Bank. We also have Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, and we also have Joaquim Levy, President of BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank. Thank you very much for being here with us. So, great thing, we all got back from the luncheon. We're all satisfied. That was a really long elevator ride, but we're set now, and let's start the afternoon session. Let me start with the elephant in the room, because I have to go to the World Bank first. What happened? The World Bank just halved the growth outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean. It was just in October, 1.6% growth for this year. Now you're saying 0.9%. What went wrong?
Well, good afternoon. Not everything is going wrong, but if you take the Latin American growth forecast for all the countries together, yes, there is a slowing down, but it is partly due to factors beyond the region that has to do with also the slowing world economy. You have commodity prices that are not working for Latin American countries, but there are also intra-Latin American things, and the main one is actually Venezuela. If you take the growth projection and you take Venezuela out, actually growth is increasing from 1 to 1.9%. What we are projecting for Venezuela is a further collapse, namely 15% of GDP. And so that is massive, and that has a massive impact on the growth forecast. I think I would not be so negative. I think you need to see that actually there are quite a few countries that are growing beyond 3%. You think about the Chile, the Peru, the Colombia, Central America, except of course Nicaragua. Even the Caribbean is doing well. Brazil is actually doubling its growth compared to last year. So all is not so negative. I think one needs to see this, that a lot is overshadowed what is happening in Venezuela.
Yeah, I have to apologize for being a Debbie Downer here and starting there, because we in the media, we tend to focus on the challenges, right? What needs to happen for things to improve as well. So you've told us about some of the bright spots that we've seen. What about, say, poverty reduction and the pace of progress?
So in the terms of the growth on the poverty reduction was quite impressive, particularly through 2013, till the end of the commodity boom. What we are seeing actually now is actually stagnation. And that has been driven by a couple of factors. Very important, so in Brazil, where this country had to go through one of its deepest recessions ever, and that has affected the poverty outlook. You see Argentina, unfortunately, poverty has increased over the last 3 years significantly. Not to talk about Venezuela, depending, I mean, the data are not so good, but you can argue what we are seeing is that poverty has reached about 94% levels. So it is enormous. So this picture is more differentiated. I think that it is also clear that there is continued vulnerability, that the middle classes in Latin America are not growing. And that, I think, should be a longer-term concern, because a vibrant middle class will be important for well-being in the future.
So Joaquim, Axel just talked about Brazil being one of the bright spots, but we do know that Brazil has been slowing down in recent months, this year as well. So what are your impressions of your economy there?
Well, the economy, first, good afternoon. The economy is going through a very, very deep change. Also, the policies are under very profound changes. I would say that the kind of wind in terms of giving more freedom to to markets, to the private sector. There is an effort to accelerate privatization and also taking government out of certain activities. And I think on top of all of this, we're doing a major pension reform. Of course, pension reform is not something easy. It's like health reform and these kind of things, where the winners get their rewards only over time. But sometimes there are some people who have make sacrifices now and they see it. So it's a political battle, but I think the political battle that we are winning, people do realize that it's very important to put the house in order in this respect, and there is quite broad support for a very sweeping reform. So the economy is a little bit in a wait and see pace. People are waiting to see the actual completion of the reform, which we expect to be somewhere on the third quarter. And it has already had some votes, preliminary votes, which went fine. But you know how Congress has its own time. So we have to have a little bit of patience, which is not very easy because we still have a large level of unemployment. But meanwhile, a lot of things are happening. There have been some changes in key sectors. There are also, say, non-constitutional legislation being voted that will open markets such as gas, natural gas, which is very important in Brazil because you have huge reserves. And in the past, most of the market was controlled by one company, which is a great company, but we want more competition. So some of the main assets, the pipelines, have been auctioned. Tremendous demand. The last segment that was auctioned just sold for $8.5 billion. It was bought by an international company, and you want to open up this market and get the right regulation for it. Same thing for an area that is so important to Brazilians and has to do everything about poverty reduction and really welfare, standard of living, which is sanitation. For too long, sanitation has been under the responsibility pretty much exclusive of the public sector. There is plenty of money willing to get into sanitation. And we are voting actually today. There is one of the reports, one of the commissions that is voting, the second commission to vote this reform, that you open up the market to private players, both national and international players. This is very important because still have a large part of the population that has no access to sewage. Water is better. Right. So the opportunities are there. People are waiting, but we see a lot of interest. And actually, in the privatization side, and I can talk to you later about that, the appetite has been enormous. In addition to the pipeline, we have auctioned a dozen airports early this year, all sold with a big premium in relation to the minimum price we had asked. We have sold a major railroad, and we have ports, and I'm at the National Development Bank, so we're a player in making these things happening. We help restructuring some of these deals, and we not so much are helping to finance them anymore, but we're helping the market to finance them. So this is really what's going on in Brazil, and I think the results are coming. And with the vote for the pension reform, I think that the gates for new investment flows will really be open everybody's waiting for that.
I spoke to the Vice President Morale a few weeks ago, and he was very positive about the asset sales and surpassing that $200 billion goal for this year. And we do want to get into what sort of opportunities there are for the private sector. But before I do that, Senator, I know that you have recognized the importance of Latin America a while ago. No wonder you've been to Mexico, Guatemala to see things for yourself. Give us some of your impressions of where the region is headed.
Well, I don't pretend, by the way, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, buenos tardes. I don't pretend to have the expertise of my colleagues. But it is clear that the Americas, we can either do really well together or we can do not so well together. And there's much to learn. We can look at the crisis at the border as a symptom of things when things don't go well, or of what is happening with Venezuela. On the other hand, the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian trade treaty has been good for all three countries. And you can see a prosperity that has arisen in Mexico that has been so good for the relationship between the United States and Mexico. I like that. The individual benefits, and corporately, we as individuals end up doing better as countries. In fact, when I was in Mexico, I asked, my gosh, with all the transnational criminal organizations in northern Mexico, why are Mexicans not coming to the United States, as they have in past when, say, Pancho Villa was marauding across northern Mexico? And they said they have jobs and they have community. And when there's jobs and community, people stay in place. That's a nice thought, isn't it? And gives us an example about how to go forward. If we in the Americas can create prosperity for those in the Northern Triangle, people in the Northern Triangle will stay in place. The other thing I'll say is we can learn. Joaquim is talking about privatizing airports. Puerto Rico did it, and it worked very well for them. Maybe that's something the United States, as we're embarking on a $2 trillion infrastructure package, but not quite sure how to pay for it. We find out how these folks did it, and that asset recycling may give us a paradigm. So we can learn from one another.
Given all of the opportunities and the benefits that you've talked about in this relationship, is the United States paying enough attention to the region at the moment?
I don't think so. And I say that not to be critical of anybody, but if, I love my wife, okay?
Where are we going with it?
She's asking, wondering how am I going with this? But if I don't pay attention to that relationship with my wife, and if she doesn't pay attention to me, as much as we might love one another, live in the same room, have the same kids, walk the same damn dog, the relationship is not what it should be. So similarly, any relationship has to be tended to. And the U.S. needs to tend to the relations that we have with our fellow Americas. If we tend to it, both sides, whichever the relationship is, will do better. If not, there tends to be more tension. And so my point being that when you have something in Venezuela, which in part is a vacuum created by the United States and Venezuela separating, a vacuum filled by transnational criminal organizations, Russians and others, who wish to extract riches without benefiting the people, that is a relationship that could have done better. And the people are paying the penalty. So.
And on the Northern Triangle, this administration has now cut aid to Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. What impact will that have?
I asked Secretary Pompeo about that because I was concerned about leaving the same sort of vacuum. And he said he's afraid that the president is afraid that money, the hundreds of millions of dollars that was intended to create more prosperity, has not been used in a wise enough fashion in order to achieve that prosperity. Okay. Well, we know the investment has been made into a judicial system, into the integrity thereof, into professionalizing the police force, but there are other things involved as well. If those other things are not being achieved, maybe we should step back and make sure that there is not a better way to do it. And then if there is a better way, to reintroduce the aid. I'm not speaking for the administration, but I'm okay with a reevaluation. I personally don't want to leave a vacuum for what I described earlier, but if we need to change so that we work more for the benefit of both countries, then that's probably a wise goal.
Joaquim, your thoughts?
Well, I think that Brazil has a long friendship with the U.S. and very strong economic as well as cultural ties. We actually we are one of the few countries with trade deficit with the U.S. in addition, of course, of services, since so many of Brazilians come to the U.S. to visit the U.S., have fun, and not only Disneyland, but everywhere. But in addition to this, I think that it's remarkable how much has been achieved in the last couple of years, and especially with the new administration, both here and in Brazil. Recently, we had a visit of the president to the U.S., and we, at this occasion, we could open so many new venues. And here, I think we have to mention, for instance, all the new measures that we're taking, for instance, in the aerospace, say, sector, because of the agreement in terms of security, TSA, the safeguards, and the agreement to use one of the best spots in the world to launch rockets and satellites, but it's not to be just to be, say, a launching pad, but because of the agreements and the trust between the countries, it's an opportunity to build a lot of business and suppliers. We already have a quite rich ecosystem in building airplanes in the airspace, and with this new relationship, we open a whole new opportunities in high-tech, say, sectors. So I think this is the kind of relationship that we have to continue to tender and build together, because it's something that brings advantage for both sides, really puts U.S. and Brazil together in high-tech sectors where, of course, U.S. has a leadership, and it's important, I understand, for the country to keep this leadership. So I think this is also part of this transformation of the economy that I mentioned before, and alignment for common interest in one side, but also interest in the other side, is really what makes the beauty and the strength a very long relationship.
I'm actually from Bolivia, and my family still lives there, and this is a reason this region is so important for me. It's my home base. Of course, Bolivia is not one country that has a great relationship with the U.S. at the moment, but in order to see this growth in the region, what I've noticed growing up in Bolivia is that every time we have a crisis in one of these big economies, I still remember the Argentina crisis of the early 2000s, everybody suffers in the region, and we felt it. It's not just the economy just going dead, it's also crime rising. The World Bank, Axel, has been very involved in the region, right? $4 billion of investments, 30 plus projects in 2018. What are you doing at the moment, and what sort of progress are you seeing?
Well, the World Bank has been involved with Latin America since we started the operation. Chile was the first beneficiary, though. We are basically celebrating almost 73 years of operations there. With the capital increase that we received lately from our shareholders, our intention is that from the public sector arm, that we will have operations in the order of $6 billion. And then we have our private sector arm that, with mobilization, we are also looking at another $5 to $6 billion. The art is basically, when we are looking at Latin America, about the growth issues, about infrastructure. Joachim was just mentioning, the needs of this region is in the order of $150 to $250 billion. And so the only solution is, how do you get the private sector involved on this? So the way we need to think about our engagement in the region is how the public sector arm can be facilitating in this. And here it is not only the macroeconomic agenda, but particularly the microeconomic agenda. This is on the competitive, the regulations to facilitate actually private sector investment to take place, as well as opening markets. Latin America is relatively closed. It's actually very close, and I think there is a lot more potential to integrate it itself into the international value chain. Apart from Mexico, The rest is not well integrated. So there are these agendas. So we would like to be actually very supportive in the macro as well as in the microeconomic agenda. At the same time, we also don't want to lose sight of the poverty agenda and the human development agenda. It is for the long-term good to create not only jobs, but you need skilled jobs, you need good education. Well, Latin America is doing well in having coverage. It is not doing well in terms of quality. If you look at the PISA tests, they are not so good. So what we need actually to focus a lot on better education systems as well as better results. So that agenda is there. Finally, there is the agenda also related to climate change. This is very important. If you take particularly sub-regions, the Caribbean, you look at it, you look at Central America, these are absolutely important areas where we will need to push the resilience agenda very, very strongly.
Joaquim, how well integrated is Brazil and the rest of the region with the rest of the world?
Well, we are not that integrated. Like any large economy, we rely a lot on ourselves. I think that historically also there was a lot of occasions where the choice was made not to get so much integrated for tax reasons and so on and so forth. I think this has changed. For a few years now, we've been engaged in, for a couple of decades, we've been very engaged with the OECD, but now in a more complete way. And I think this is a very nice, mechanism to revisit a number of regulations and structures in Brazil. So I think we of course, in the last few years, especially in the 2000, the impact of commodities also changed somewhat our trade. In 2000, more than half of our exports were actually manufacturers, and these declined because the value and the amount of commodities increased so much. Now I think we are having our rebalancing. But let me talk about something that Axel mentioned is very important in Brazil. It is sustainability and how we do in terms of also climate change and our commitments in this area. This is very important for Brazil. This is something that we owe to ourselves, not only to the world, because a country where agriculture is so important, and mind you, like the US, we feed a lot of countries around the world. Export of food is so important. And food means peace. I mean, I was in the World Bank for 3 years recently, and we are so much aware that conflict in so many places is driven by lack of food. So to have food in abundance around the world is fundamental to keep peace. But you only can have good agriculture and food production if you do it in a sustainable way. And this is really more and more driven in the minds of people in Brazil, including all the people in the agriculture sector. Together with this, Brazil is also a country that pays a lot of attention at its energy matrix. 40% of all the energy used in Brazil comes from renewables, from clean sources. More than 80% of our electricity comes from clean sources. And more wind power and the solar has been important, in addition to traditional hydropower. And we also have biofuels that in Brazil, we consume more ethanol than you consume gas. And this is really has a tremendous impact. And we managed to do this using very little land. And as we see, of course, the industry of sugar and the consumption of sugar changing, this is very good because ensure the continuity of jobs and income for many people, but more and more in a high-tech approach. So ethanol is a major source of energy, not only for moving, say, cars, etc., but also in producing electricity. We don't waste any part of a sugar cane. So these are the, I'd say, main drivers also of our growth. Sustainable agriculture, producing food for the world, helping peace with these, and also having clean energy in all possible ways, including natural gas.
The Trump administration right now saying that they will raise tariffs on Chinese goods from 10% to 25% on $200 billion of goods, threatening 25% on $325 billion of goods as well. The reason that I bring this up is China is such a large consumer of commodities, which has really had a huge impact on the commodities market. Joaquim, is this a problem?
Well, of course, we all love free trade, and we know that trade has been a major contributor for the reduction of poverty around the world in the last 25 years. Brazil, together with the U.S., is a big provider of foods to China, as well as other commodities, including iron ore and even, well, sorts of steel and things like this. But so I think that we believe that income in Asia will continue to grow. And we are really working to increase partnership with all countries around Asia, where we see wealth generation and new demand patterns.
I really want to get to Asia and perhaps compare it a little bit with Latin America in a second, but I want to go to the senator first. Senator, trade is very important for Louisiana, and you have now reintroduced legislation to expedite small-scale LNG exports to Latin America and the Caribbean as well. Tell us a little bit about the trade structure in your state and how important this bill is.
So when it comes to the United States, my state receives more foreign direct investment per capita than any other state. That's driven by several things. That big Mississippi River is right there, which can then take goods from the interior of the U.S. around the world, but also receive them. We have lots of expertise in oil and gas, so we have companies which are operating down off the coast of Brazil. It's also a staging point for operations in the Gulf of Mexico on the Mexican side of the Gulf of Mexico. The low-cost natural gas, in turn, has fueled much of the industrial boom that is taking place now. Incredibly important to us. We produce a lot of natural gas, as another point. And you mentioned earlier about the Caribbean. I am sponsoring a bill, small-scale LNG. You think of a Caribbean island. They are threatened by rising sea levels. They would like to be able to replace a perhaps higher carbon footprint source of fuel with a lower, more cleanly burning. That's logically natural gas. Few countries are blessed with Brazil's ability to have hydropower. That is unique to you. So the Caribbean islands are either going to use renewables and or another cleaner source, which would be logically natural gas. So we're trying to promote that. So it would be not just that we're receiving foreign direct investment, but that we can use our natural resources to otherwise go out and help the economies of others. Again, capitalism properly understood, everybody benefits, not just one.
The focus this past year seems to have been on all of these negotiations between the U.S. and China, and yet the USMCA, or NAFTA 2.0, has yet to pass Congress. How important is this for Louisiana?
I think it's important for all three countries. So again, I mentioned the foreign direct investment that we're receiving. When I was in Mexico City, spoke with executives from Mexichem. They make a nice investment in my state. I asked them to make even more. But they are spread out across my country, the United States. So I think it is important for all three countries. I think the president has done his best to try and assuage the concerns of those who are in certain states which have suffered, if you will, from, if there's been a suffering from that process. So I'm cautiously optimistic it'll pass because he does seem to have attempted to address workers' concerns.
This year.
This year, what month are we? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
With the China trade negotiation stalling right now.
Yeah, and I think that emphasizes the importance to have certainty in other markets. I'd like to think that the president's threat to raise tariffs will kind of dislodge those negotiations. Hopefully that will do so. I think it's incredibly important to both countries. So that said, again, USMCA, I'm cautiously optimistic this year.
Axel, you've also overseen at the World Bank East Asia. China was one of the countries that you've been working on before taking your current role. how does Asia compare to Latin America, and how competitive is Latin America given all of this attention that we're giving to emerging Asia like China, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, India?
So clearly, the biggest difference, of course, that there are much higher growth rates. But let me also say, Latin America has also had in the past high growth rates. One sometimes forgets that between 1950 and 1970, the GDP of Latin America tripled. And one forgets that Latin America can grow fast as well. But I think a couple of differences is first of all, is certainly the trade or the outward orientation is very, very strong. Secondly, regional integration, which is much, much weaker in Latin America. So one is not taking advantage of the internal market. And I think a third aspect is certainly thinking much more in the long run. What I think in Latin America is too much obsession with the short run, and one forgets the longer term. It's interesting in our work, for example, with China, where the Prime Minister, not only Li Keqiang, but also before, asked us to think on the long run. We did a study on China 2030. We did also on China urbanization, because they still will have to manage a migration to cities of the equivalent of the population of the US in the next, till 2030. So those are the issues they are interested in. We did it also in Vietnam. I see that much less in Latin America, and I think that is going to be very, very important. And finally, that certainly Asia is, I think, more ahead in terms of what is happening with the latest technology. Take digitalization. That is on the forefront of policymakers. It is, I think, much more of an urgent agenda in Latin America. It is noted, but it is not that urgency to act. And the risk is, if you don't embrace that agenda fast, you're going to lose out.
Joaquim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's never fast enough in this area. The bank is getting more and more involved into that. Brazil actually has quite a vibrant ecosystem in the startups and so on and so forth. And as a public bank, we're doing things carefully so that you don't, say, crowd out the many initiatives that you have. We had actually a few interesting, say, companies that have been listed in New York, 1 billion here, 2 billion there. But there is much more to do. Actually, the recession also intensified the demand of companies. So one of the few sectors in Brazil in the last couple of years that has done quite well has been everything related to IT and to transformation and the way and process in companies and so forth. But I think that AI and other mechanisms can make a transformation in Brazil, in particular in the delivery of public service. This is something that we at the bank are very much involved in creating, say, hubs and ways to attract innovation to then help them to disseminate this through, say, municipalities and so on. One of the big problems in Brazil is the wage bill of the public sector. Now, we cannot really fire everybody, but people eventually will retire. And the important thing is that then we don't hire people to do the same thing that they used to do 20 years ago, but rather take this opportunity to introduce a host of new ways to deliver public services, from health to security to you name it. So this is one of the key areas that we are operating using the initiative, the creativity, the ingenuity of the private sector, both in Brazil, but also open to experiences from abroad. And I think this will help us to address one of the main problems in Brazil, and I think in several countries in Latin America, which is productivity is slowed down. Actually, it's a global problem, but if you do in the right way, it will help us to address this fundamental thing to increase income levels, which is how to get higher productivity growth.
So we've been talking about economic integration, the benefits of trade, but of course, some of the downside of that is the negatives that we can see out there. And Senator, you've been very vocal about trade-based money laundering. You have a bill that you introduced in February, securing the border and making drug cartels pay for it. So give us what's the reasoning behind this sort of poetic justice that you came up with?
Well, let me speak more specifically about trade-based money laundering, which all of you are familiar with, in which you have illegal profits from illegal activities laundered or moved out of a country by attaching itself, if you will, to licit trade. Huge problem. The tri-border area, I am told, is where lots of illegal products are made and shipped through Western Africa up to Europe, maybe cigarettes, for example. The taxes are not paid in the EU, and the difference between that which would be paid with taxes is sent to support Hezbollah. Now, clearly, it is in the interest of us all to do something about that. It's very complicated. When I ask folks about trade-based money laundering, they kind of throw up their hands and say, well, I'm not quite sure. To put it in perspective, I'm told that cartels move 60 to 100 billion a year out of the United States from selling drugs, but the U.S. only confiscates about, at the most, 10 billion. So do the difference. And that money is financing criminal activities, and in some cases, terrorist activities. By the way, I met the Prime Minister of Mali. I just opened it up and I said to him, do you have a problem with money laundering? And he launches how all the problems in Western Africa with Boko Haram is related to transnational criminal organizations laundering money through Latin America, going over to West Africa on its way up to the Middle East. This is a global problem. What can we do about it? Well, I think I've been working with my staff, Maria Sierra's over there, on how can we use a distributed ledger so that if goods are going from the U.S. to Guatemala and the invoice is going through Panama, that when the invoice comes back to Guatemala, it has not been decreased by 50%. Clearly that's important. It would be robbing Guatemala of part of the duties that they would otherwise receive, that they could then use to build out their infrastructure, and by building out that infrastructure, attract foreign direct investment, which would then hopefully give someone a reason to stay in Guatemala as opposed to migrating to the United States. A virtuous cycle, if you will. So we are very interested in that, and if anybody is interested in it, my assistant is here, Maria Sierra. She has a young child, but don't worry, call her anytime, day or night. She'll take your phone call. But it's something that we are actively thinking about how to address.
And of course, it's not just the drug-related issues in Latin America, but also perhaps one of the perennial questions and issues that has been corruption. And Axel, just tell us how corrosive this issue is, especially when you're trying to have projects and move forward in Latin America.
Well, it's not only a Latin American problem, it's unfortunately a global problem, but we need to be aggressive on this. And I think that is certainly, when you just mentioned about customs, and we need to see how we can strengthen institutions, strengthen transparency, and that is not only in our operations, because that is only a little drop in the bucket. You need to see how you can work on systems with governments on it that it is overall improved. And I think this remains an agenda, whether that is on the bilateral level or also on the multilateral level. I think nobody alone can do it, but I think only together. I think also the private sector has to contribute to this. And I think we need to have respecting norms and push hard for a kind of rules-based systems. And you see sometimes good progress. Unfortunately, we have also seen again, declines happening. But I think this is something, mind you that actually when we, for example, in the bank, particularly the Fund for the Poorest, where we have mobilized $75 billion, one of the key factors in determining the allocations, as a performance-based allocation has a disproportionate way on good governance. So there we are looking at that certainly also when we are distributing the money.
By the way, in a few minutes, I'll open the floor for questions. So please, if you have any questions, do keep them in your head. I'll get to you as soon as I can. Let's talk a little bit about investments in Latin America, because we have seen really increasing interest coming from China as well. And that's, people have taken a very cautious look at what these investments mean. The Global Development Policy Center saying the $17.5 billion of Chinese capital went into Latin America. Joaquim, President Bolsonaro railed against Chinese investors. Was that only campaign rhetoric, or will it spill over into his presidency? Should we be more careful about where all of the money is coming from when you look at investments into the region?
Well, I think the secret to have a healthy foreign development investment, system is how this investment is applied. What are the rules in the country? What kind of standards you have, the transparency, and so on. So I think that in Brazil, we do receive foreign investment from all over the world. And of course, there are up and down. Some periods we get more from one country than from others. But as long as these are on a competitive basis, that of course you look at security issues, and they are in sectors that can be regulated or, like I say, open to competition. I think that our experience has been that we can be pretty open. Now, the world is full of money. There is the problem in the world today is not money. There are capital flows everywhere. There is a lot of savings both in the Western side as well, of course, in China, where there is excess capital because of increases in productivity. So what is very important in countries like Brazil, and I think in the whole region, is to have good projects. We are very happy that we have assets that you can sell, and people really have a lot of appetite. But our effort, and in particular at the bank, it's really to get with new projects, greenfield, and do in a way that it's accessible not only, say, for a state bank from country A, B, or C, or multilateral, but also for institutional investors, because they are such an important glue also, and when you think of the world economy, but you know that this money, the risk appetite of this money is not very big. So our effort in Brazil is continue to make the whole environment more conducive to investment that require transparency, that require some limits on risk, that are sustainable. And if you can produce good projects, good opportunities like these, I think you get the best kind of investment flows from everywhere. And I'm convinced that this also applies from money from China. So Brazil had to face big issues about corruption in the past. And what we showed is that if you have strong institutions, if you have a good and free press, and you have a good judiciary, you can go through a painful process, but get out is stronger and with better practices, and actually become more interesting to investors. And this is really what we've been through recently, and where we want to build from.
How high are the hopes, Joaquim, of the aerospace industry after President Bolsonaro inked that deal with the U.S., with the aerospace industry being able to launch rockets from Brazil? And what sort of industry could that create?
Well, I'm sure that everybody in this room knows Embraer. They've been extremely successful. They were almost too successful. So our competition went down under the Canadians, and they were sold to Airbus. It just happened that in the world you have only two very big companies, which is Airbus and Boeing. So we end up having a partnership with Boeing to face the new, say, industrial organization in this sector. But this just shows that we do have a strong, quite vibrant, say, aero, but also space sector. Now, what the discussions and the agreements with the U.S. Have opened to Brazil is that to expand these sectors also more related to the space. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have a very good base which is very close to the equator, so it's very cheap to send satellites from there, but we are creating an environment where all the suppliers can also be there. So using the technology that we already have, the fact that this will be one of the most competitive areas to send rockets, and say the legal environment that we have created, and the clearances, of course, security clearance from the US, I'm very confident that this will be an extremely attractive area for new investment. Again, it's great to privatize. We are fully committed to that. Everybody asked me about the stock of Petrobras. I'm not going to talk about this, but everybody asked about this. But it's even better when we have whole new sectors opening up because we have the right, say, legal environment, regulation, and openness to, all partners around the world.
Right, so let's now open up the floor. If you have any questions for our panelists, please raise your hands, and you can also just turn on the microphone. Yes, please go ahead.
Infrastructure deployment is lagging behind, and for 5G implementation is key, fiber spectrum, etc. What's the agenda of the World Bank in terms of helping the region get that sense of urgency and actually act upon it?
For those people who haven't been able to hear her, digitalization and what the World Bank is doing more in the tech sector. Axel.
So what we are doing is we providing support to governments on the regulatory framework. We are also willing to do investments, particularly in those countries where they are lagging behind. Particularly the low-income countries, sometimes you have very low internet penetration, and that to do this. In fact, we were talking, I was talking actually with the country team, for example, a country like Haiti has only 14% internet access. Why can't you do that in a couple of years, get to 80-90%? So that is on the regulatory, but you will also have investments. What we would like to have is, of course, that the private sector does those investments, but there may be some investments that need to be taken by the public sector, and we will gladly fill in that. What we would like to highlight is that a lot of other countries are moving much faster with the whole 5G. And so where are those countries? And we are highlighting that this is an urgent area for action. We are, of course, as Joachim said, there is a difference between Brazil that has also a lot of capabilities, but then you have take the smaller countries that are much more behind. So there, I think that we will need to help a lot more. I think there is a need for also much more consultation to push it. I think I'm looking at the European Union, for example, where also individual countries may be lagging behind, but there has been a push from the European Union to push much harder all the 27 member states. I think you will need to have something that also pushes all states in Latin America much more ahead. That may require more also political action, so that there is, if you wish, a political mandate combined with then an implementation mandate for the private sector, but also for public sector action, including multilateral support.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the floor? If not, Senator, so we have been talking about all of these investments going into Latin America. Is there anything a sector in particular that you would find interesting that the private sector here in the U.S. would have an interest in, or any sectors that the U.S. could learn from when it comes to Latin America?
So one thing that seems natural, Joaquim mentioned the natural gas in Brazil, the ultra-deep exploration for oil that's occurring off your coast. I'm told in Argentina they have shale plays with the same geology as the United States. Now, I can tell you from my state and other states in which you begin to develop these natural resources, it has a great positive impact upon the incomes of the people who work there. Great positive impact. And families which formerly were not doing very well suddenly are doing very well. And by the way, as you begin to create that, you produce more natural gas. Natural gas burns more cleanly than other fuels, and you begin to decrease your greenhouse gas emissions. So I do think that there is a natural sort of, if that technology can be employed, that can help bring prosperity there. You see where I'm going with that. Again, that virtuous cycle that can occur. As regards what the United States can receive, again, I sat next to a fellow a couple years ago at a benefit dinner, and he was speaking about, from D.L. Piper, they just see Latin America as a growth area. And sure, it's hit a little bit of a flat spot, but they just see the middle class, the educated folks there, and then the rising out of poverty others as a real market. That's capitalism in which, properly understood, both parties win. And if the U.S. can help bring prosperity, the U.S. will receive prosperity, just as my state has investment from Mexican. And hopefully my state offers something back to Mexico. So that's my vision.
How concerned are you that as we see the growing influence of, say, countries like China in the region, and the U.S., at least in the sense of optics, seems to be retreating from the region?
So what I don't quite know, and I'm quite willing, I very much would like to learn from folks, clearly there's a concern about China using the debt trap to make people indebted to them in a way in which they effectively have to cede, control, and are otherwise obligated. The U.S. doesn't have state-owned enterprises, but we have a lot of private companies that are doing investment. Again, going back to Argentina, it's my understanding that some of the super majors are helping to do that. I mentioned earlier that my state has oil field service companies that are in Brazil. So what I don't know is the degree to which the effectively public investment by China is supplanting private investment from the rest of the world. I think that China's history so far as a trading partner, aside from buying commodities, they buy a lot of commodities, but as an investor in your country is mixed, where people, again, end up with debt or with resources that are stranded and are not very used, but nonetheless you still have the debt. So hopefully China raises its game, but hopefully our private sector is equally investing.
Joaquim, what are you seeing on the ground?
I see that the most important thing is the quality of the investments. And of course, very often, the advantage of private investment has a discipline. If it doesn't go to try to manipulate regulations or whatever, which sometimes happen, but it's not the rule, the beauty of a private investment is the discipline. You do projects that can be sustainable, you stand up, rather than sometimes making, say, just the wishes of a government and so on. So I think this is positive. And this is why Brazil is so much into the privatizations, into getting the private sector involved. I think, for instance, we have a lot of internet, the part of say, broadband internet is a huge country. But in many places, we realize that you don't have to have a state-owned company to do it. The private sector can do it if you do in the right way, give the right incentives, and that doesn't mean subsidy or anything like this. And we at the bank, we have actually helped foster a number of companies, local companies, foreign companies also, that have been able to deploy the internet. For instance, in the agriculture frontier, we have some places in Brazil that used to be very, very poor 20 years ago. And then now they're booming in Bahia, for those who know Brazil. And of course, these agriculture, they are really keen in using technology. How are you going to use all the modern things to get a very high productive agriculture? You need the internet. Well, bingo. You get the private sector. There are several companies now doing that, and I was talking with the Minister of Science, which happened to be an astronaut from NASA, to expand that and relying on the private sector. In Brazil, two things: education and private sector. And in education, the main thing that we are also focusing is to ensure that you have a really good syllabus and that the syllabus is really implemented. And the way to do that is through regular testing and then remediation through connectivity. So here is where you get all the gains when you get some of the digitalization that was mentioned before.
And now looking towards the future, we'll have to leave the conversation here and thank our panelists for this great conversation. Thank you.